plaisir de parler avec vous et je vais parler anglais. C'est votre tour d'écouter en français. I want to talk a little bit tonight because I think it's important about how we in the United States, as well as in countries like France, have ended up with this extreme right. If it was as simple as the figure of Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen, we wouldn't have anything to worry about. In fact, it's far more serious than a particular bigot or proto-fascist. My work over the last few years has focused on the disintegration of the capitalist democracy in the United States. That was the investigation that I carried out in my book, Death of the Liberal Class, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy, and the Triumph of Spectacle. And the last book before this one, which I wrote with the cartoonist Joe Sacco, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. Those three books I look at as a kind of trilogy. Death of the Liberal Class being what happened to those mechanisms within our capitalist democracy that once made incremental and piecemeal reform possible. As Noam Chomsky correctly points out, the liberal class was never designed to be the political left. The liberal class was designed to act as a safety valve so that in moments of distress or crisis, such as the Great Depression, there was the possibility to ameliorate the system. But all of the forces that created significant social change came from the bottom up. They were movements that never achieved power. In the United States, this would have been the Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, and we in the United States had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers were murdered, tens of thousands lost their jobs and were blacklisted. And of course, the civil rights movement. I teach in a prison. This semester I'm teaching Chekhov. He's actually kind of perfect if you come out of the underclass, Chekhov. It's always a gamble, what you bring into the prison. But Chekhov grew up in intense poverty. I mean, even to the point where as a boy, his family moved to Moscow and left him as a servant. He slept in a corner of the kitchen. And then the other thing about Chekhov that's remarkable and makes him not only a remarkable writer, but a remarkable human being is that after finishing medical school, he devoted, the only medicine he ever practiced was treating the poor, who he never charged. And it kept him honest, kept him grounded, so that he was in the poorest towns, hovels, neighborhoods. And I think that's what gives his writing such power and such authenticity. But I taught a course a year or two ago in a prison in New Jersey, and when you write your proposal to teach, It's the exact opposite of writing something for a course catalog where you're trying to entice undergraduates to come watch a lot of movies or something in your classroom. It has to go through the filter of the Department of Corrections. And so I wrote a proposal to teach about the Constitution and the three branches of government and the Founding Fathers, which the prison authorities accepted, and then I bought all of my students Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. That's a very important book, because what Zinn understood is that in the United States, we had a system by design that was closed, that was dominated by a male, aristocratic, white, slaveholding group of oligarchs, and that the vast majority of citizens, women, Native Americans, African Americans, men without property were disenfranchised. And all of that battle, especially up through the 19th century, was a battle to open the spaces of that democracy. And it was opened through radical, progressive, militant movements. In the book Death of the Liberal Class, that began as a book that was proposed to me by a large publishing house in New York called Knopf. Now, how the minds of editors in large publishing houses work is a mystery to me. They decided they wanted a book on the press, and they called up the former editor of the Washington Post, Len Downey, and asked him to write it, and he refused. They called up the former editor of the New York Times, Joe Lelyveld, and asked him to write it, and he refused, and I was third on the list. Why they thought that I would write a book that would bear any resemblance to what Len Downey or Joe Lelyveld would write about the press is a mystery. And when I turned in the manuscript, the editors at Knopf read it and hated it, and said that they would publish it, but after they gave it to an editor to take out what they called all the negativity. So I frantically searched for a small publisher. You get half of your advance, and I frantically searched for someone who would, I said, just pay them off that half, you can have the whole book. And in that shift, I began to reflect on all of the liberal institutions. The press, not just the press, but academia, in our case, the Democratic Party, in your case, the Liberal Party. We can talk about Trudeau, your Obama later. The arts being totally commercialized and co-opted, as well as the liberal church. And all of the pillars of the liberal establishment had disintegrated, not just the press. And in the United States, it went back to World War I. Woodrow Wilson, you may have heard that Princeton students occupied the president's office at Princeton University for 36 hours, calling for both the Wilson School of International Affairs and Wilson College to be renamed. Wilson was one of our, not only was a racist, who resegregated the federal government and the military when he became president, but was the great destroyer of radical movements. And with the advent of the war, as Randolph Bourne, who writes about that period, correctly calls war as the health of the state, and we see it now, that in a moment of war and of fear, which is stoked by the state can accrue to itself all sorts of power that otherwise citizens would never grant it. And that, of course, is the Patriot Act, and that is C-51 in Canada. Now, the evisceration of civil liberties. And what we saw was the rise of the first system of modern mass propaganda, the Creel Commission and the Committee for Public Information, which ends up being the model that Goebbels uses when he creates the Nazi propaganda machine. Indeed, he uses Edward Bernays' book, who came out of the Committee for Public Information, called Propaganda, as one of his seminal texts. And that was employing the understanding pioneered by Le Bon, Trotter, Sigmund Freud, and others, that people were not moved by fact or reason, but by the skillful manipulation of emotion. That people could be made to confuse how they felt or how they were made to feel with knowledge. That's Fox News. That's Trump. And this became very dangerous. So that after the war, we entered what Dwight MacDonald, a writer I admire very much, he's not read as much as he should be, called the psychosis of permanent war. The age of the fight against communism, the internal and external enemies. And as MacDonald said, none of the political theorists of the 19th century had grappled with this concept, including Marx. Marx writes almost nothing about the culture of war. He mentions the Franco-Prussian War in passing and hopes that the Germans will win, because if the Germans win, the workers' state will come into fruition faster. But that psychosis of permanent war becomes the weapon by which all of those movements that gave expression to the underclass, to working men and women, were destroyed. So that in the United States, there's nothing left. The Wobblies, the Socialists, the Progressive Party, the old Communist Party, especially by the McCarthy hearings in the 1950s, where you had vast purgings. Some of these great academics, including Chandler Davis, our great mathematician who comes and teaches at the University of Toronto, either forced completely out of academia or into exile. And that, in essence, left us defenseless. And what happened is that the business or corporate elite, in its myopia, failed to understand that the liberal class was vital to the maintenance of the system. You have the breakdown of capitalism in the 1930s. And the liberal class, embodied by Franklin Roosevelt, understands. Roosevelt actually writes in a letter in 1930, he uses the word revolution. He says that if we do not carry out significant social reforms, we will get revolution. And so, in the United States, that's how you get the government creating 15 million jobs, public works projects. And Roosevelt says that his greatest achievement as president was that he saved capitalism. And that's correct. But with the death of those progressive movements, crushed in the name of anti-communism, the people were in essence left defenseless. And that gave rise to this very pernicious ideology, which John Ralston Saul, I think, has written quite presciently about, neoliberalism, which is, as Saul points out, a utopian vision. There's nothing in human history that justifies the absurd belief that you can run a society based on the dictates of the marketplace. And yet that, of course, is what has happened almost completely in the United States, but Canada is hardly exempt. And the rise of this ideology, and Karl Polanyi writes about it in his great work, The Great Transformation, where he chronicles unfettered, unregulated capitalism, because the United States branded his wife a communist. He taught at Columbia. He actually lived in Toronto, and he would fly back here on the weekends because his wife was not allowed in the country. But he says that unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a force which, left unchecked, commodifies everything. Human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity that it exploits until exhaustion or collapse. And he actually, though he's an economist, he actually uses the word sacred. He said, when a society loses the capacity for the sacred, when nothing has an intrinsic value, and everything, human life, the ecosystem, is judged solely on its monetary value, then that society propels itself forward until exhaustion or collapse. And that, as Polanyi points out, is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. The ideology of neoliberalism, and we should remember that that ideology was shoved down the throats of Canadians by the Liberal Party. It's the Liberal Party that orchestrated austerity, largely, in Canada. Created large segments of populations who were considered redundant or superfluous labor. Some of you may have driven through the United States, although you can drive through parts of Canada and see much the same. But in city after city, it is boarded up factories, abandoned warehouses, pothole streets. And this is how empires die. They hollow themselves out from the inside. And many of those people, unskilled labor, who live in these communities, particularly poor people of color, who have no work, with all of the attendant problems that poverty brings. Their bodies are worth nothing to corporations. On the streets of abandoned cities, but locked in cages. They can generate $40,000 or $50,000 a year for prison contractors, private phone companies, private money transfer agencies, prison construction firms, guards unions. And that's why we have 25% of the world's population, of the world's prison population, although we're only 5% of the world's population. And that's why 80% of the people locked in cages are poor people of color. That thrusting aside of huge segments of the society under neoliberalism created this very dangerous force, this faux liberal establishment embodied by figures like the Clintons and Barack Obama, and I'm afraid Trudeau. People who speak in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism, and yet assiduously serve corporate power. So it's under Clinton that we get NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the working class in the United States since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, which makes it very hard to organize. It's under Clinton that we get the explosion of the prison population, the draconian drug laws, the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, which pumps $300 billion into the expansion, the physical expansion of the prison system. It's under Clinton that we get the destruction of welfare, and 70% of the original recipients in that welfare program were children. It's under Clinton that we get the deregulation of the FCC. It's under Clinton that we get the destruction of public broadcasting, something that is now taking place within the CBC. It's under Clinton that we get the repeal of the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act, and Chrétien saved you from this. He saved you from this banking crisis that had created firewalls between commercial and investment banks, and that precipitates both our national financial collapse and the global financial collapse. Now, at that moment, everything turned politically. Because what you created was a bankrupt liberal elite. And that liberal elite, which colluded with corporatists and with the Republican Party to deform the economy and to reconfigure the society to serve corporate profit at the expense of the citizenry, retreated into the culture wars, cultural diversity, but it did so in such a way as to deform the very concept of justice, especially for the oppressed. So feminism becomes about having a woman CEO or a woman president, in the case of Hillary Clinton, not about empowering oppressed women. Promoting an African American, in our case to the presidency, ends up putting into power a figure who Cornel West correctly calls a black mascot for Wall Street. So you had most of the society, certainly the poor, especially the working poor, crushed, struggling, stripped of the ability to organize. Unions in the United States are now less than 12%, only 6% in the private sector. And in the name of austerity, program after program was cut as whole sections of the society went into freefall. It affected all of the underclasses, but it created something very dangerous within the white underclass in the United States, which is now manifesting itself in the Republican primary. I was in Montgomery, Alabama, with the great civil rights attorney Bryan Stevenson, who has spent his life defending people on death row in Alabama who, not surprisingly, are almost all poor black men. And we were walking through the streets of Montgomery, and Bryan was pointing out one Confederate memorial after another. Indeed, when you enter Montgomery at the outskirts of the city, and half of Montgomery is black, there is a massive Confederate flag. And Bryan said almost all of these memorials have been put up in the last 10 years. And I said to Bryan, that's exactly what happened in Yugoslavia. Because the war in Yugoslavia was not caused by ancient ethnic hatreds. It was caused by the economic collapse of Yugoslavia. When people reached that point of despair and hopelessness, they retreated into mythical narratives about themselves and about the past. A neo-Confederate movement which is sweeping the southern United States among poor whites, and which is part of the base that Trump is catering to, along with the gun culture and the militias and the Tea Party and the Christian right. And I spent 2 years writing a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. You know, I struggled over that. I didn't use that in the title lightly, and my friend Bill Moyers deeply opposed that, calling these people fascists. And I went to the two great living scholars in the United States on fascism, Fritz Stern, who himself fled Nazi Germany in the 30s and wrote The Politics of Cultural Despair, and Robert Paxton, who taught at Columbia and wrote The Anatomy of Fascism after 2 years of research to see if they could argue me out of the word. But that fusion of the iconography and language of American patriotism and the Christian religion, that sacralization of the state, is, of course, exactly what fascism is. It is a form of religious belief. And I come out of the liberal church, and I think the great failure of the liberal church is that they did not call out the Christian right for who they are, which is Christian heretics. Jesus did not come to make us rich, and he did not come to bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs across the Middle East. And you don't have to spend 3 years at Harvard Divinity School as I did to figure that out. But the liberal church, in the name of tolerance, tolerated the intolerant. And the driving force that I found in that movement was what all of the great writers of totalitarianism cite as the engine of totalitarian movements, which of course is about magical thinking, always, and that is despair. That white underclass had suffered, like many people of color in marginalized communities, the crimes of poverty, which George Bernard Shaw in Major Barbara, with that great speech, calls the greatest of all crimes. Familial breakdown, societal breakdown, despair that led to addictions, domestic violence, drug abuse, broken families. And they retreated into this world of magical thinking because the real world almost destroyed them. And one of the most disturbing events that I covered for this book was going to Detroit with Tim LaHaye, who wrote the End Time series, which are the best-selling books of all time in the United States. These series of apocalyptic visions of the end of the world and the gruesome death of believers and the battle between the returning vengeful Messiah and the Antichrist. And I listened to this language, which is not pulled from the Bible. It's completely invented by this movement. And the excitement in the room about the destruction of the world around us. And I realized that the engine of this belief and the lust for this apocalyptic violence came from people who were almost destroyed. by that world out there and long to see it eradicated. And that apocalyptic vision, that belief that violence will finally purify the earth, is as common to the Christian right as it is to ISIS. Because those who gravitate towards ISIS are also those who have been discarded and turned into human refuse by neoliberalism, as anyone who has been in a banlieue outside of Lyon or Paris understands. 5 million North Africans in France, and I've lived in France, and it is a deeply racist culture. Those who come, these immigrants, not accepted by the French as French, yet growing up in French society, returning perhaps to Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, but being viewed by those in these countries as French, caught between two worlds, unemployed, in despair, suffering from a loss of identity, are easily captivated by these apocalyptic forces who have, like all fundamentalist movement, this binary view of the world. Black and white, good and evil, believers and non-believers. The 30 or 40,000 foreign fighters that ISIS now has, 4,000 to 5,000 with European passports, draw on the same pool of discarded youth who gravitate to the Christian right and who make up this movement that figures like Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump appeal to. Fritz Stern, in The Politics of Cultural Despair, said it with a breakdown of Weimar Germany. There was a longing for fascism before the word fascism was invented. And that's what's dangerous. It's not Trump. It's not even Marine Le Pen. It is that movement that is looking for a figure who will legitimize this bigotry, racism, intolerance, homophobia, the anger towards a liberal elite that spoke up against these forms of sadism and yet turned their backs on the poor and the working class. So that the language they speak is a language designed on purpose to antagonize the college-educated elite, who they rightly believe betrayed them, and who they falsely believe promoted the interests of marginal peoples within our societies. Falsely because although there were faces of color, although there was an acceptance by the elites of different ways of being, the vast majority of the underclass was assaulted and forgotten. For over 2/3 of African Americans in the United States, life is worse than it was when King marched in Selma. And that's the danger we face. I visited the Creationist Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky, which cost millions of dollars to build. They brought in the people who did the anatromic figures from Universal Studios. So, if you ever visit, and it has huge parking lots for all the school buses, because they bring the children in. You go in and they've recreated the Garden of Eden with a waterfall, and Eve and Adam in the water. Eve's turned so you can't see her plastic breasts right now. And the T-Rex with the saddle. Because of course all the animals were created in 6 days. And the guide was in the group I was in, was saying, I'm sure you all wonder why T-Rex has such big teeth. Well, that's because Adam and Eve used T-Rex to open the coconuts. And then we went into the next room, and there was a replica of Noah's Ark, a small replica of Noah's Ark, and the guide is saying, I know you all wonder how Adam and Eve, or how Noah got the dinosaurs on the ark. Well, he only put baby dinosaurs on it. But see, all of that's funny here. But it's not funny when you're sitting in a crowd of 40 people who believe it. It's terrifying. And when people transfer themselves from a reality-based world into the world of magical thinking, you're not going to rationally argue them out of it. Indeed, if you make rational arguments that attempt to dismantle their belief systems, they will respond to you with unmitigated rage and hatred. Because it's all they have left. And it's all they have left because we failed them. And the rise of these movements, people who have lost hope, people in despair, people who are being demonized in the case of Muslims, portend an age of violence and a form of fascism. Because what demagogues like Trump are doing, and it's interesting to watch Trump, because I don't think that he set out with a plan. I don't think he's bright enough to have a plan. There's a scene, I'm just going to grab his water. There was a moment when I covered the war in Yugoslavia. Slobodan Milosevic goes to Kosovo. Now, Milosevic was a banker, a fairly colorless bureaucrat. And he's speaking to a group of ethnic Serbs in Kosovo who are being harassed by the Kosovar Albanian majority. And Milosevic senses the anger in the crowd. And he begins to say to the crowd, they will not beat you. I will not allow them to beat you, and the crowd erupts. And you can see, I've seen the footage, the light goes off for Milosevic. And he suddenly realizes that he can ride this hatred to power, which he does. And that's what's happening in the United States with Trump. If Trump disappeared tomorrow, someone would rise to take his place. Nothing will change until there is a radical restructuring of the economic system to reincorporate these people back into the system. And that is as true for the jihadists who are recruited out of the banlieues or the poor neighborhoods of Brussels, as it is for the Christian fascists who are showing up at Trump rallies. And that will never come from the established systems of power. Because the only thing on the political spectrum certainly in the United States, is this boutique focus on diversity, while the engine of economic repression continues its relentless pace to reconfigure not only our society, but the global economic order into a form of neo-feudalism. NAFTA, the WTO, and now the TPP, as Ralph Nader correctly says, is the most brazen corporate assault or power grab in history. And you in Canada have much to fear from the TPP, because it seems likely that if Canada signs the TPP, your health system will be destroyed. And I urge you all to look closely at what is in that 5,400 and something page document. Because, and this affects Paris, all these non-binding agreements are overridden by special trade tribunals. Any public asset, any public enterprise, from the post office to education in the TPP agreement, has to be made, corporations have to be given a competitive, what they call level playing field. They have to be competitive. Which means that any kinds of state support or state subsidies have to be withdrawn. We've already seen the privatization of the Postal Service in Britain with disastrous effects. If you know anyone in Britain, you can ask them what's happened to their mail service. The rise of the TPP, and you would think by now we would have figured out that trade agreements are a scam, is like Polanyi understood. This process of unrestrained, unchecked, unfettered, unregulated capitalism that only knows one word, and that is war. That will continue its assault. It has no internal restraints, and it now has no external restraints. And the elites understand this. The last book I wrote, Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt, is different from the 3 books that I wrote previously. Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy, and The Triumph of Spectacle being about the rise of an image-based or spectacle-based society, the severance from a print-based culture, the world of ideas replaced by the world of cliches. And this book, the latest book, no longer seeks to analyze the world around us, but recognize that resistance on a grassroots level is all we have left. Stopping the machine from working. And let me laud the 3 courageous Canadians who chained themselves to the pipeline. We have to build militant, resistance movements that function the way the civil rights movement functions, where we overload their jails. Where groups of people stop a train, go to jail, and tomorrow another group shows up and stops that train. Because no one in Ottawa and no one in Washington is going to do it for us. And we have no time left, as anyone who reads climate change reports understands. Now the elites understand what's coming. They've run scenario after scenario in the NSA and other internal security organs about the effects of climate change and the refugees, which we're already watching out of Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And they have reconfigured the law and built the most sophisticated security and surveillance apparatus in human history, and I covered the Stasi state, or the collapse of the Stasi state in East Germany. We are the most photographed, monitored, eavesdropped, watched population in human history. And all of our information is not only taken and captured by the government, but stored in perpetuity. And if you go back again and look at the great writers of totalitarianism, including Hannah Arendt, totalitarian states always carry out wholesale surveillance not to uncover a crime, but to keep a file on every individual or on groups of individuals, so that at the moment you seek to shut them down, you can impugn criminal intent to whatever it is they have said or done. Some of you may know that I sued Barack Obama in federal court over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. That permits the U.S. military to carry out policing on the streets of American cities, overturns over 150 years of domestic law. To seize citizens who substantially support, that's not a legal term, that's not material support, substantially support Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, another nebulous term, strip them of due process, and hold them indefinitely in military facilities. Just like the evisceration of privacy, which is patently unconstitutional, so is the empowering of the military to carry out extraordinary rendition against U.S. citizens on the streets of our cities. And what has happened in our court system is that they have upended our most basic civil liberties. They have rewritten them by judicial fiat. So that unlimited corporate campaign contributions becomes the right to petition the government, or a form of free speech. Although Edward Snowden courageously exposed wholesale surveillance, the fact that our court system has not responded is a telling example of how it has become, like all major institutions, a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state. And to the surprise of the Obama administration, when I brought that lawsuit in the Southern District Court of New York, we won. And Judge Catherine Forrest, in her opinion on her ruling, said correctly that if this law is allowed to stand, it allows the government to criminalize whole groups of people. And she brought up the specter of the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II. Now, this created great problems in the judiciary. The day that she issued her ruling, the lawyers for the NSA and the other security organs showed up and, in the name of national security, demanded she lift her temporary injunction and put the law back into effect. She refused, to her credit. That was Friday. 9 a.m. Monday morning, those same lawyers were in the next court, the appellate court, and demanded the same thing, and unfortunately the appellate court agreed. The lawyers and I knew Obama would appeal, but we were mystified as to why they were so aggressive. And I think the assumption was that they're already using the law, that there are already dual U.S.-Pakistani nationals in places like Bagram or other black sites who, if they could get out of captivity while that injunction was in place, could hold the government in contempt of court. Now, what happened next is emblematic of how the judicial system is become an instrument of repression. The court wouldn't rule and wouldn't rule. And I was also a plaintiff in a case before the Supreme Court called Clapper versus Amnesty International. And in that case, I and others had challenged wholesale surveillance. This was before the Snowden revelations. And the government lawyer stood in the Supreme Court and said that our charge that we were being monitored by the government was speculation, and then added that if we were being monitored, the government would tell us. And so the Supreme Court threw it out. And the Second Circuit waited for that decision and said, since Hedges has no standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, he therefore has no standing in Hedges versus Obama, and the case was dismissed, not by ruling on the merits, but by denying my ability to bring the case. Now, in that 2-year legal battle, they ran a national opinion poll on Section 1021 of the NDAA, and it had a 97% disapproval rate. But it passed anyway. Nobody wants their privacy taken from them in Canada or the United States or anywhere else. But we are powerless now to respond. It doesn't matter what we want. In 2008, when they proposed allowing the large banks to loot the U.S. Treasury, constituent calls in Congress were 100 to 1 against the bailouts, and they passed anyway. Over and over. We live in a system, the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin, who we just lost recently, calls inverted totalitarianism. And by that, he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression in a demagogue or charismatic leader, but in the anonymity of the corporate state. And in inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, the Constitution, and yet internally have seized the levers of power to render the citizen. And that creates political paralysis, which I also saw in Yugoslavia. A self-identified liberal class that is powerless to respond to the needs or protect the rights of the citizen. And the backlash, and this was true in Weimar, the backlash is directed not only against that bankrupt liberal elite, but the supposed liberal values that they defend. So that all of the gains that have been made in civil society, the protection against women, the condemnation of bigotry against the GBLT community or Muslims or undocumented, all of it's rolled back. And that is what we're struggling against at this moment. And yet, the engines of corporate pillage remain unchecked, which means that this contagion will only expand. Now, there is one important difference. Canada, we do everything wrong, and then 5 or 10 years later, you copy us. It's kind of a mystery how that works. But there is an important difference between Canada and the United States. And that is that the United States is a deeply violent culture. We are a culture that is steeped in blood and has been since our founding. It is in our DNA. Genocide of indigenous peoples, 95% of whom were killed. Slavery, the empowerment of white vigilante groups, whether they were slave patrols, or the Klan, or the Pinkertons, or the Baldwin Felts. And they have their modern equivalent in the militias, in the Christian right. We've created a system where we've largely criminalized the carrying of weapons by people of color, and we allow the white underclass to amass whole arsenals. Richard Slotkin, the great historian, calls it regeneration through violence, this belief that we can regenerate ourselves through violence. So people are rising up in the United States against this culture of violence. Black Lives Matter 3.1. Citizens are murdered every day in America, most unarmed people of color. But again, the state, because of paralysis, does not respond. They march in the thousands, tens of thousands, through the cities of Ferguson or Baltimore or Washington, New York. And it does nothing to stop this modern form of lynching. And that's why this year we have had 27 law enforcement officials assassinated. I'm not talking about gun battles, I'm talking about assassinations in the United States. The refusal on the part of the state to respond is building a mounting frustration that across the society will increasingly express itself through violence. The white underclass is withdrawing into their mythical world of white supremacy and neo-Confederacy. People of color in our internal colonies are finally rising up against state-sponsored terror. And the corporate engine of assault continues to disembowel the country. We are an empire, you are not. And we have the disease of empire. We are expanding beyond our ability to expand. We are funneling our resources, scientific, technological, financial, towards unchecked military structures, 51% of discretionary spending to the military, and that doesn't include Veterans Affairs, our nuclear weapons program, and all the black budgets that we're not allowed to see. By best estimates, $1.6, $1.7 trillion a year. As the society implodes because the resources are squandered in futile and endless wars, the harsh forms of control that maintain empire at its edges are brought back to the homeland. Drones, wholesale surveillance, militarized police, indiscriminate violence, taking away of civil liberties. Because the elites understand what's coming. They understand that the ideology of neoliberalism is collapsing. It no longer has its efficacy. Alexander Berkman in The Invisible Revolution, his essay, talks about revolutionary change as being subterranean, invisible. The way water boils in a kettle and you don't see it until the steam and then you hear the whistle. Once a population no longer finds credible the ruling ideology, whether that's monarchy or communism or neoliberalism, then the only way those regimes can maintain control is through the iron fist. And that's where we're moving. That's what's already happened. 1, 2 more terrorist attacks on American soil that are blamed on Muslims. We're already seeing a very frightening rise in hate crimes. We'll begin the physical disintegration of the United States. And as this is underway, the fossil fuel industry plunges us towards collective suicide. It's depressing, it's bleak, it's frightening. But it does no good to live in the Pollyannish world of Oprah, of happy thoughts and positivism, which is a form of infantilism. The greatest existential crisis of our time is to at once accept the reality before us and respond. I don't know if we can succeed. I do not even know if we will survive as a species. But I know these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. In the end, I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. And this is a fight for life against, in theological terms, forces of death. This is an act of faith to rise up in the belief that the good draws to it the good, even if all the empirical evidence around us says otherwise. That is the moral imperative of revolt. That is what Reinhold Niebuhr calls sublime madness. Rebellion is our only hope. And those rebels who stand up offer us our only chance. Thank you.
Hi, so I am a performing artist. This is my role in this revolution that we're talking about. And in one of your past lectures, I heard somebody asked a question about what you thought about Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, and I remember you saying, oh, I don't like him. But you're clearly a person who's made it very clear how much you appreciate the role of the arts. And I guess I am interested, because my thing now that I'm trying to get out before Christmas is I'm doing a Trudeau drag, and I'm going to start a YouTube channel that I hope will be able to shake up Trudeau-mania rather than contributing to it, because that's my fear. And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts about what an effective comedian looks like to you.
Well, I mean, my problem with Stewart and Colbert is that they'll make fun of the foibles of the system, but they won't attack it because they benefit from it. They're all multimillionaires, and they need those commercial interests to keep their shows on the air. I mean, authentic art is always radical and subversive, and the corporate culture has done an extremely efficient job of marginalizing or crushing that art. It's interesting that the first public works program that was destroyed by the corporatists during the New Deal was the theater, the public theater. And it was actually destroyed before the McCarthy hearings. It was destroyed in the 30s because it suddenly brought theater into communities where instead of The Lion King or its version, I guess arsenic and old lace, or if it plays that old, it was reflecting people's lives, like the Cradle of Rock. And every revolutionary movement has depended tremendously on artists to give expression to another vision, as well as to the reality that people endure. In fact, I covered the Velvet Revolution in Prague, and it was almost completely led by artists, including Václav Havel. I covered the war in El Salvador, and every time the FMLN, the rebel movement, went into a town, they went in with theater groups, musicians, poets. The same was true, with Lorca in the Spanish Civil War. So you cannot have a revolutionary movement if you do not have a cadre of revolutionary artists who are willing to stand up and, as Emma Goldman said, make ideas felt. The problem is that the corporate society is configured in such a way that everybody who deals with beauty or truth has been shunted aside, including journalists. And it's extremely hard, if you care about those transcendent qualities, to make a living. And that's by design. So there will be no revolution if there are no great artists. And these artists always speak uncomfortable truths, before the wider society begins to grasp them. But they're absolutely vital. One of the tricks I always used as a foreign correspondent, because I was often parachuted into countries that I didn't know very well, is that I would always look out for the avant-garde theater. And I would haul some poor translator with me and sit in the back row, because I knew that these young writers and actors and directors were grappling with things within their society that the mainstream had yet to understand or express. There will, if we don't have artists, we won't have a revolution.
Sweet.
Hi. I wanted to say, and I have a little question after that. I'm glad that the whole talk kind of focused in some way on fascism, and because to me, and it's been a long while I've been thinking about it, and it's actually showing its face more than ever. But to me, all the people who are actually taking decisions, who have been engineering the last century and before, like families of bankers who have made their riches on war since hundreds of years, they know where the road goes. They know that violence is coming and blah blah blah. And so my question somehow is, do you think they know when they just bet they will win? They are trying to, and also I'd like to share an experience I had when I went to demonstrate against the G20 in 2010 in Toronto, which to me really magnified the latent fascism in all this. We were a thousand of people, Canadian people, arrested with no reason and kept in jail by guardians, and living that felt like I was in 1984. It felt like I was, oh shit, this is fascism. I'm living it right now. I heard about it, the story, the myth, and etc. But so I'm curious about what you have to say. That you already told a lot, and thank you. About the actual, I don't know, people who went there, they got slammed in the face. Anybody who dared open their mouth and demonstrate, almost. Some of them got radicalized on some level, and also got traumatized by the experience. So you see, I hope you see where I'm going with my question. In the day-to-day life, where we all have to feed ourselves, to pay the bills, and etc., what can we do? In a situation where it will be the police force bringing in anti-terrorist laws on activist groups like Greenpeace or whatever, and so in this world of almost, 1984, it's kind of a movie we thought it's just a fiction, but it seems like their bet is that they're going to win this game that way. Do you agree with that? What do you think about
Well,
this?
they certainly know what's coming. That's why they have created the physical mechanisms and rewritten the laws to strip us of the ability to protest and to criminalize dissent. In my court case, we used the leaks, the 5 million email leaks by the hacker Jeremy Hammond. And in correspondence with this private security firm, Stratford, with Homeland Security, they were attempting to tie a group called US Days of Rage, which was linked with Occupy, to Al-Qaeda, so that they could use terrorism laws against it. That's, these terrorism laws are not really written for terrorists. They're written in such a way to create a precedent within civil society so that we can all be condemned as terrorists if we rise up. And Hannah Arendt also writes about this in The Origins of Totalitarianism when she discusses the plight of stateless people. She herself was stateless, pushed out of Germany after 3 weeks being held by the Gestapo and almost killed, stripped of her passport and becomes, is no longer a citizen of any country. And she said that when you have a segment of a society that is stripped of their rights, then rights become privileges that can be taken away. And this is what we have seen in America's internal colonies with poor people of color. Their rights have been taken away. Police serve as judge, jury, and executioner. 94% of the people in our prison system never had a trial. They never had a trial because the system would crash if everybody had a trial. They're forced to plea out. They're given 18 charges. They committed, at best, a fraction of them, if any of them. If they go to trial, they're tried on all of those charges. So the students that I teach in the prison with the longest sentences are the ones who tried to make the system work for them. So when you create what Hannah Arendt calls these omnipotent police forces that can kick down your door at 2 in the morning, that can shoot you with impunity, whose word gets you convicted for 30 years. And the moment a society unravels, the moments there's instability, with the flick of a switch, you have the legal and physical mechanism to do it to everyone else. And that's what's happened. It's more pronounced in the United States. But there already is the physical mechanism, especially with the militarization of the police, as well as the legal mechanism. So that if there is any kind of significant unrest, which I think there will be, the state is prepared. And they're prepared not only in terms of the mechanism, the mechanisms under their control that they can use against us, but also the unleashing of white vigilantes who always are tolerated by the state because they will do the dirty work of the state. And, that's what the Klan was about. That's what the Tea Party is. That's what all these groups are about. So you have a kind of fusion between state violence and vigilante violence. And this Karl Marx kind of got with the lumpen proletariat, that you could always recruit significant segments of the underclass, of the lumpen proletariat, to serve the most retrograde elements within the society for a chance to be able to carry out vengeance against perceived enemies and a little bit of power. They know completely what do they think? Well, they're so wealthy.
What should we do?
What should we do?
Or do you agree with the idea or the saying that this revolution is a revolution of the mind? We won't win this by physical But
No,
sometime maybe that's a question. That's what.
No, it's going to be won by physically disrupting the mechanisms of exploitation. It's on a sustained level, day in and day out. I mean, both Idle No More and the Quebec students movement understood that it had to be sustained resistance. And we've got to carry that understanding into our confrontation against the fossil fuel industry, against the Trudeau government for supporting C-51, the TPP. You know, we've seen it in Europe. 10,000 Spaniards surround the parliament. You know, there's a scene in Kissinger. Let's go back to Popper. Karl Popper, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, says the question is not how do you get the good people to rule. That's the wrong question. Most people attracted to power, Popper writes, are at best mediocre or venal. The question is how do you make the powerful frightened of you? And that's why the last liberal president we had was Nixon. Not because he had a conscience or he was liberal, but because he was frightened of movements. And so there's a scene in Kissinger's memoirs where the White House is surrounded by tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators. Nixon has taken empty city buses and put them end to end, circling the White House for protection. And he's standing at the window, wringing his hands, going, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that's just where people in power should be.
My question, I guess, follows fast on the heels of the last person. As we walk out of here, what would you think would be the most effective things for us to do? I guess one of the problems is at least for me, I recognize that it's important to go ahead on all fronts. But I see a really huge need, and I see at the beginning of a coalition between student movement, the unions, environmentalists, and networking. But people are still off in their own silos a lot. So that's where I see a huge need for networking. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I think that, you know, what we've seen, like with the Occupy movement, is that it's kind of fragmented into other movements. So the anti-fracking movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the struggle in the United States to raise the minimum wage, these are all vital. And there certainly is a political consciousness. I was just with some activists from Ferguson this weekend. I mean, they get it. One of them was invited to the White House, a hip-hop artist named T-Dubbo, because I guess they wanted a couple of people from Ferguson to go to the White House. And Obama asked him, "Did you vote for me?" And he said, "I'd vote for you. You've never done anything for black people." They get it. So the consciousness is there, and the organizing is there. And, you know, I think that we can't confront the entire system. I think we have to confront its multifaceted forms of oppression with an understanding that the fight against fracking is part of the fight against state lynching by the police, that it's all one fight. And this is part of my problem with Bernie Sanders. Number one, we're never going to build a new society until we destroy imperialism and militarism. And number two, this is a fight of the oppressed around the globe. And Bernie Sanders sells out the Palestinian people, which I will not do. Especially those of us in the industrialized world do not have the right to stand up and decide which groups of the oppressed it is going to be convenient to stand with. We are going to stand with all of the oppressed or none of the oppressed. Because that's what the struggle is. It is a struggle against huge segments of the underclass that have been abandoned and repressed by a global neoliberal order that we have to destroy if we're going to survive as a species, which means overthrow, in case there's any Homeland Security people here.
Chris, I wonder, given that there are still quite a few people at the nights, I wonder if we should have people maybe you'll take groups of questions? Or how do you prefer taking each individual question?
Well, I'm easy. I don't have to fly out till tomorrow. We don't want to hold everyone here all night. Probably more interesting things to do in Montreal. Why don't we do 4 or 5 more questions? Then anyone has questions, they can come up when I'm signing books. Want to do that?
Well, I was just thinking we would ask people to ask their questions and then let you respond to 2 or 3.
Okay. All right.
So why don't we do that, gentlemen?
Mr. Hedges, my first question is, what do you think, what percentage of our society, American and Canadian, understands the gravity of these issues that you spoke of and the issues that you write about? And the second question is, I think a wide engagement of society would be important to bring about these changes. But that would require convincing and educating society about these things. What are your thoughts on that? How would it be possible? Thank you.
Ladies?
Hi, sir. I listened to you.
Speak in the microphone.
You mentioned the importance of bringing a radical change in the economic system, and that resonated with me. I have been researching lately the basic income proposal movement, and I wanted to know what you thought about it, if you cared about it, and if you think that it will bring an important change if people vote for it as a majority in the country. In what countries would it be more possible or more effective? General thoughts on
It's more of a personal question and might apply more to your earlier years, but throughout your life, have you ever fundamentally changed opinions about some serious questions and what people think?
Okay. So, what percentage of the people understand? I think a huge percentage of the people understand it's not working for them. But I don't think that they've articulated why, and I don't think they've articulated an alternative vision, which goes back to Berkman's essay. I don't think they're fooled by neoliberalism. The problem is that when this matters, so you blame the vulnerable. It's the fault of Muslims, fault of undocumented workers, fault of homosexuals, and that's what fascist movements does. It takes that legitimate rage. So I think broadly across the political spectrum, most people recognize it's not working, but they have yet to articulate or capture that vocabulary or language by which they, number one, can accurately describe their own reality and what that alternative will be. And that's education. But of course, the corporate systems have seized controls of not only academia, but the electronic forms of communication to narrow the debate to acceptable opinion. So, for instance, in the United States, over Syria, there's a huge debate which goes like this. Should we bomb them, or should we bomb them and put boots on the ground? As if those are the two alternatives. Reminds me of what Dorothy Parker once said about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress that went from A to B. It's kind of like that. And so if you actually have a critique of the system, then you're locked out of the discussion. And you argue about what Freud calls the narcissism of minor difference. I think, as I understand your question, was about voting. Was that right?
the basic income proposal. Have you heard
yes, I have. I'm totally, well, you know, I wrote a column, I got up and gave this long talk, which got printed as a column. I think it's called What It Means to Be a Socialist. And I kind of listed all of the, including a guaranteed income, guaranteed pensions, you know, that the unemployed would all receive $600 a week. I mean, it's all kind of laid out there. I'm a socialist. I mean, unlike Bernie Sanders, I actually am a socialist. Well, voting, well, as Emma Goldman said, if voting was that effective, it would be illegal. It's movements. It's all radical changes come through movements. I mean, I vote. I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter. I voted for Jill Stein, the Green Party. I mean, it's a kind of protest vote, but I don't spend a lot of time. You know, I mean, I spent my time, I was just out in Denver speaking to anti-fracking activists. I was just in Washington speaking to the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which I fully support. Which is trying university by university, institution by institution, to take Israel down the way the apartheid regime in South Africa was taken down. It's movements. Have I changed my opinions? Yeah, I mean, I think that one, you know, part of the reason I build walls, I mean, I don't have a television, I don't tweet, I don't have a Facebook page, I don't know, what else is there? Instagram, I don't have any of that. I read constantly because I don't want to speak in the language they give me. One of the reasons I like reporting, and I report a lot for my books, is because once you get out and listen to people, it implodes your assumptions that you carry, however intelligent you are. So I think being an intellectual is a constant evolution and a constant form of growth. An example would be, I grew up in a liberal church, I mean even radical church. My father was very close to the Catholic worker and the Back to the Land movement. Dorothy Day, the Barragans were heroes in our household. And so when I wrote my book on the Christian right, I went in with a great deal of disdain towards the right. And the more I spent time with the believers, not the people running the mega churches or figures like Pat Robertson or these guys, but with the actual people, I developed a great deal of empathy for what they had gone through. I believe that they are part of a very frightening and dangerous movement, but I also believe that they're being very skillfully manipulated by these figures. So I actually begin my book on American fascists really telling the stories of their disintegrations and despair and struggles. And so there was a perfect example of how I, you know, because of the environment I came out of, was not as empathetic or understanding as I should have been. But I come out of a long radical tradition. I mean, I was never a Republican or anything. My father was an anti-war activist. Well, he was a veteran of World War II. He was very involved with the civil rights movement, and he was involved in the gay rights movement in the 70s. His brother, my uncle, was gay. And my father had a particular understanding of the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and 60s, and was quite outspoken about it. Indeed, he had a church in Syracuse, New York. I was at Colgate as an undergrad. There was no gay and lesbian organization, so my dad brought the gay and lesbian speakers to the campus. And then eventually kept pushing the students to publicly form an organization. There was no organization, but they were too frightened to sort of come out, understandably. It's a big frat football culture. And so my dad fixed that problem by driving down to Colgate one day, taking me out to lunch, and telling me I had to found a gay and lesbian. I did. And I would go into the dining hall, and it met every Tuesday night with my name. I never went, but I was publicly associated. When I would go to the dining hall, I would give the checker my little card for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and he would hand it back and go, faggot.
Ladies' mics.
I'm seeing a very frightening trend of despair among millennials, people in the age range of their 20s. I've seen my son go from being very active in the Quebec student movement, being one of the 6 that was arrested at the Plan Nord conference, in whom Charest made that flippant comment. And I've seen him and other people of his age backing off and giving up, throwing in their hands. How do you keep up the hope within that generation, with the generation that's really going to inherit and have to cope with the mess that we're in right now?
Gentlemen?
Hey, Chris. Chris, my question revolves around false flags. So, these events are documented historically. All governments do it and have done it. The King David incident with the Israelis, Bay of Tonkin with the war in Vietnam. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that, with the U.S. government, both foreign and domestic? Because, they say that they brag about it in the WikiLeaks documents that were, leaked, that they use false flags in foreign countries. Everybody did it. The Muslims do it, the Israelis do it. So that's my question.
Hi, I would love to hear you more about the animal industrial complex. I know that is something you write more and more about these days, and I think it's really great for all of us who are not only motivated by anthropocentric concern for the oppressed humans, but also for the oppressed oppressed animals. And when you say that we should stand for all the oppressed or none of the oppressed, I think, like many ecofeminist and anti-speciesist activists, that this should include other animals. Do you think it should include other animals, and how can the left be made to understand that?
In terms of hope, we can't do it alone. We need a community. If we don't have a community, the forces that are arrayed against us are so monstrous and frightening and monolithic that we are going to succumb to despair. And I find that, although I don't organize, integrating myself into demonstrations and protests gives me a kind of energy and a hope, however Pyrrhic it may be. So a couple of years ago, I was with 133 veterans, mostly from the Iran-Iraq War. We were outside the White House to protest those wars. It's on YouTube, everything's on YouTube. And Watermelon Slim, Vietnam vet, played taps on his harmonica. They folded the flag, the veterans of a young man who had been killed in Afghanistan a couple weeks before. And then everybody went silent, somebody beat a drum, everybody marched through the snow and stood on the White House fence until they were arrested. Many people were crying. And what was moving about that event, it was moving on many levels, is that when they were cuffing us, it turns out the police had all been in the National Guard, and they'd been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they would cuff us, and they would go keep protesting. I think that the danger is trying to do it alone. I think that's why art and culture is so key. Music, poetry, grasping onto those transcendent qualities that make us human. I think Richard Wright, when he wrote about slavery, said it was, songs and chants that we had in place of freedom. That's what the blues was. And so we need to envelop ourselves, both in a human community, and we need to be in touch with forms of expression, artistic forms of expression that finally allow us to understand that we're not alone. But we live in a society, especially with our electronic devices, that is designed to atomize us. I mean, sitting in front of your computer, typing up angry diatribes against Trans Canada still sitting alone in front of your computer, which is where TransCanada really wants you. We need to recover that human community if we're ever going to be able to resist. In terms of false flags, yeah, I mean, false flags are a kind of a standard technique that the CIA in particular has used, all over the world. I mean, they will invent situations to be able to carry out what they want to do, whether that's the 1954 overthrow of Arbenz or the 1953 overthrow of Mossadegh, or, I mean, that's, that black propaganda. The Israelis do it all the time. That's standard operating procedure for all governments. And the media quite willingly serves as their echo chamber. And the last question was animal. Yes, I am a vegan. One of the things that disturbs me about the climate summit in Paris is that nobody's talking about the animal agriculture industry, which is as responsible, if not more responsible, for global warming than fossil fuels. Aside from the sanctity of life, and I think that you're right, just from the point of view of the environment, getting up tomorrow and becoming a vegan, not eating animal products, which also happens to be pretty good for your health, is a way to take a very easy but important step to begin to break an industry that is, as responsible as the fossil fuel industries for destroying the ecosystem. It's kind of easy to do.
In 2011 or 2012, you wrote that the Black Bloc anarchists were the cancer of Occupy, and today you were talking about how nonviolent direct action such as Black Lives Matter is basically being laughed at by the state and is not necessarily eliciting a response. So I guess I'm just curious, I mean, when you're advocating strictly for nonviolent direct action and yet it doesn't get a response from the state, and you're saying that violence is basically inevitable, what do we do now? We just get beat up and wait?
So these questions have been a bit, my question is a bit similar to some that have already been asked, but I just want to know a bit more about how you can grapple with daily life, buying into the system most of the time and trying to work towards a revolution. Or another example of that is how to grapple with the harms of neoliberalism and also the harms of neoconservatism. For example, if Trump were to become the candidate, how would one respond to that situation?
I mean, I think that it's, in terms of violence, it's always the state that determines the configurations of revolt. So for instance, I covered the war in El Salvador. And you had a series of incredibly large mass protests by labor unions, student groups, against the military regime, until in 1979 they set up machine guns on the roofs of downtown Salvadoran buildings and opened fire on the crowds and gave birth to the insurgency. I wrote my first book, War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning, is about the poison of violence. I think that once you employ violence, even for a just cause, you become contaminated by it. And that is why, for me, violence is always tragic. And the fact that the state does not respond to the nonviolent protests against police terror and police murder means that they will build a response, at least among certain segments of the society, that is violent. But I find that frightening because that is a language the state speaks really well. I spent so long on the outer reaches of empire watching the capacity the state has to inflict violence, including in the United States, 60,000 members of the special forces who are just desperate. And if they feel threatened, they will bring back those forces to the center of society. And we can't compete. The state seeks to demonize the movement. And that's how they use the Black Bloc. Because Occupy was a mainstream movement, middle-class movement, driven by the sons and daughters of the middle class, who, as Bakunin said, had become déclassés intellectuals. They are déclassés. They had been pushed out, heavy student debt in the society, no place for them. And revolutions, and that's what I would like to see, revolutions are fundamentally nonviolent in this sense that, as all the theorists of revolution, I think, agree, from Crane Brinton to Jeffrey Davies, and that is that no regime is overthrown until significant sectors of the security forces and the civil service defect. That's what I saw in East Germany. So you had 70,000 people marching in Leipzig. Honecker, the communist dictator, sends down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd. They get there. The local communist authorities refuse to allow them in the streets. Honecker's out within a week. Same thing happened with the Tsar. Cossacks are sent to crush the rioting in Petrograd. They refuse to do it. The ministers rush the Tsar back on a railway carriage from the front. He abdicates on a railway site. Same thing in Iran. Iran, the Shah had built up, I think, the 4th or 5th largest military in the world. And he flees the country, and the military issues a statement that it will not defend a discredited regime. So, I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We knew what the Serbs would do if they broke through the trench system, which is slaughter a third of the city and drive the rest into displacement and refugee camps. But I also saw that once you have to employ violence, you become infected by that violence even in a supposedly just cause. So I'm desperately hoping that we can build a movement that will bring out the kinds of mass protests that I saw in Eastern Europe, and that will paralyze the structures of internal control so that they can't respond. But I'm also not blind to the myopia of the state and the inability of the state to respond. And so if we descend to a level of violence, it may be a natural outcome, but it's something that at that point it is, as all violent campaigns are going to be, is going to be tragic. The problem with the Black Bloc for me, I saw it in Oakland. So I have friends, Ishmael Reed and others, these great African-American leaders in Oakland who have been fighting police repression and state repression more valiantly and longer than probably the leaders of any other city in the United States. And they watch these Black Bloc kids come in, mostly white, male, suburban. And as Ishmael said, if they want to break windows, why don't they go up to La Jolla, where Romney and all the rich oligarchs live, and break their windows? Nobody in Oakland's going to care. Why are they breaking windows of poor people? And my big problem with the Black Bloc, number one, they were heavily infiltrated by the cops. But my big problem with them is that they would graft themselves onto a protest if they threw rocks. It was more a problem on the West Coast. It didn't really happen much in New York. And then they could run, and were largely young. And they left behind undocumented workers, especially in a city like Oakland, mothers with children, disabled, the elderly, who paid the price. And I found it kind of unconscionable. Let me also say that I probably should not have used the word cancer. That's a word that has been used by regimes in the past. And if I was going to rewrite it, I wouldn't change my argument, but I would probably not call it cancer.
kind of similar to some of the questions that had come before, but it was about how you reconcile daily life and trying to work towards a revolution. Also in terms of voting, how to reconcile like the harms of neoliberalism and the harms of neoconservatism.
Well, I think we got to get over this thing about voting. I don't think it's that important. I think that, you know, sitting around waiting for Trudeau to come fix things is kind of a gross misreading of how power works. We tried that for 8 years with Obama. I think it didn't I mean, how do you reconcile it? I mean, I think like anybody who sees what's happening around us, I have to cope with despair, especially in terms of what we're doing to the climate, what we're doing to the ecosystem. And yet, you know, despair, like cynicism, will kill us. You know, I actually spent a lot of time talking about that in the book, Wages of Rebellion. That I think that standing up and resisting, and Havel writes about this in his 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, an act of resistance is an act of faith. It has a power that is often unseen at the moment it's carried out. So that I was in Prague for the Velvet Revolution, 1989, and throughout the streets of the city were posters of a young Charles University student named Jan Palach, who in 1968 had gone to Wenceslas Square, lit himself on fire to protest the Soviet invasion of his country and the overthrow of Dubček. 4 days later, he died of his burns. His funeral was a non-event, never reported by the state media. The students who were carrying his body to the cemetery were broken up by police. When his grave became a shrine, his body was exhumed and cremated, and his ashes were given to his mother, and she was forbidden from reburying him. 2 weeks after the communist government fell, 10,000 people marched to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. I was in Wenceslas Square when Marta Kubasheva, the great Czech singer, walked out on a balcony. She, in 1968, had sung an anthem of defiance called A Prayer for Marta. And when Dubček was overthrown and the pro-Soviet regime was installed, her recording stock was destroyed, she was banned from the airwaves, and in the intervening years, she had worked on an assembly line in a toy factory. And when she walked out on that balcony in front of 500,000 Czechs and began to sing the prayer for Marta, every Czech in the crowd knew every word. That is the power of resistance. The power, as Havel says, to live in truth. The power to hold fast to an alternative narrative, which at the moment that you stand up for that narrative may not be acknowledged by anyone around you. And that is an act of faith. But I believe that when you carry out that act, it resonates in ways that at the moment the act is carried out is not seen or recognized. So there's a moment in Occupy Wall Street, again it's on YouTube, where I was saying don't taunt the police. Most of the egregious acts of violence were carried out by what we call the white shirts, the officers. And I said, these police, we only have to deal with the white shirts an hour or two a day. These police officers have to deal with the white shirted assholes all day long. And I was giving a talk after, a few months later, after Zuccotti had been dismantled. And a guy came up to me and said, I'm a white shirted asshole and I read your books. And that was a good lesson for me. And I read King. I should not have said what I said, even if he's the only one. which he probably is. Because if people within structures of power can hear, then at that crucial moment when it comes time to make a decision, such as with, sending armed paratroopers to fire on a crowd, it has the capacity to create paralysis within the structures of power and bring them down. And that's the only way we're going to bring them down.
Can we handle a few more questions? Or shall we wrap it up?
Let's do 2 more.
2 more? Okay. You heard the man. So 1 gentleman and 1 lady.
Good evening, Mr. Hedges, and thank you for joining us this evening. If I seem a bit nervous, I'll try and explain. Imagine I was 12 and you were some kind of Backstreet Boy, or perhaps a Spice Girl of some kind. I would just like to share perhaps 2 reflections. In fact, I'd really just prefer your comment on. I'd like you to comment perhaps a bit touching a bit on the first question that was asked to you concerning Jon Stewart and artists. And it's slightly relevant, I feel, because we have a lot of stand-up comics who refuse to visit universities because of what they deem to be, oversensitive students. This whole idea of PC culture. I'd like to get your opinion on this. Some might see it as perhaps a form of leftist cannibalism. Where we have this veneer of purity, where if we were able to access this very, very astute language, it's almost like wearing a pair of plastic gloves. It's somehow more leftist than thou. Is there something to be criticized there, mentioned? I'd like to get your opinion. Number 2 is more. George Agamben speaks of this in a book of his. He takes a jurisprudence approach, which is he speaks of this state of exemption, and he mentions 9/11 and our whole conception, particularly in the West, of the terrorist, which I feel has a historical straight line. And I would, I wouldn't begin to anywhere precisely, but we could go from the anarchists of 1914 to the communists until the terrorists today. Are we delving more and more into this jurisprudence and this cultural state of exemption, where if we can deem somebody to be a terrorist, all of a sudden they're stripped completely of their rights and are immediately dehumanized? Is there direction that this war on terror, and amongst other wars, is pushing us towards as a Western civilization, if I even permit myself to say that?
Good evening. I'm wondering what you think, given your experiences in the courts and the cases that you mentioned, whether resort to the civil legal system is still an effective tool to regain some of the privacy, the rights that we have lost, or to correct some of these other problems, such as global warming. You do have movements like the Beyond Coal movement in the U.S. that has used the courts to retire hundreds, maybe thousands of megawatts of dirty energy. So to what extent do you still think the courts are an effective tool?
So, in terms of the PC culture, yes. I mean, it can become a kind of cultish, self-obsessed, inward-looking form of moral purity, as any ideology can. Where you kind of attempt to ferret out heretics within your own ranks. Mario Vargas Llosa wrote a book about this called The Secret Life of Alejandro Maita, which is about a Trotskyite group that splits, and there's like 3 guys sitting in a garage fighting with each other about ideological. So, on the one hand, I think we do have to be sensitive in terms of language, in terms of inclusiveness and respect. On the other hand, I think you're right, that it can, in the hands of certain people, become a kind of pietism. And then, what was your other question? I'm getting tired. What was it? I didn't write it down.
Essentially, this state of exception that we can easily switch to as a civilization if I suppose, the media or the community at hand can deem someone to be a terrorist. I mean,
Oh, right.
the ultimate fear being that anyone, essentially criminalization of dissent.
Right, well, what happens in the Middle East is a perfect example where we don't recognize state terror. We have decapitated through militarized drones and airstrikes far more people, including children, than ISIS. And ISIS, which doesn't have an air force, is responding in kind. So when it takes the Jordanian pilot and burns the pilot in a cage, it is doing what we do every day in Raqqa, where we incinerate whole families. Yes, it's cruder, but morally it's the same. And that is violence and counter-violence, which I think is what's so depressing about the response, that the industrial violence that created the mess in the Middle East is now somehow touted as the antidote. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a perfect example of the inability to see the evil within, that externalization of evil, that posits that if we remove a certain segment of the population, evil itself will be removed. And that's just dug us into this great morass, which is only getting worse. And this question, what was it again?
The courts.
The courts. Yeah, the courts, well, when we did that lawsuit, we didn't think we were going to win. Nobody thought we were going to win. Glenn Greenwald told me it was a waste of time. I mean, we just got lucky. But my feeling was, I didn't think we were going to win, but I thought, I can't stand by and just let them do it. I've got to resist, even if I fail, and I did fail in the end. It's law. It is law. I mean, we actually told the Democratic leadership, if you will write into that provision that this provision does not apply to American citizens, we will drop our lawsuit. And they wouldn't do it, because it was designed for U.S. citizens. So, I mean, we've seen the courts in the anti-fracking movement used as a weapon to crush the movement. So if you do all that effort of education, Denton, Texas being a perfect example, organizing, people rise up to protect their communities, the health of their children, then you have the state legislature, or in many cases the courts, in Colorado, Ohio, Pennsylvania, banning the ban, saying that you don't have a right to control your own environment. And so law has become an instrument of corporate repression. Seizing, of course, for the building of the pipelines by eminent domain. So I don't have much hope for the courts. If you can find lawyers, as I did, who are willing to take cases and at least create a headache for them, I think that's useful. But I don't think that significant change is going to come through the courts. It's going to come through us. And it's going to come through us, going out and putting our bodies on the line. Getting arrested is more time than I care to donate to my government. But I do it, and I'll keep doing it, because I got kids. And I may fail. But when I'm gone, at least my kids will be able to say that their dad tried.